With the situation in West Asia more and more complicated, and with no immediate signs of this war coming to an end, there are, at this stage, way more questions than answers. Joining us to analyze the situation, Ian Bremmer. Thank you, Ian, very much for being with us. What I thought I'd do, as we frequently do, is list some basic questions and then get your sort of answers on what I believe covers some of the essential points. So first up, how likely is regime change in Iran to succeed? How likely is it to succeed?
Right now, there's no effective plan, which is why President Trump seems so all over the map. They're talking with the Kurds and maybe arming them a bit inside Iran, talking with them in Iraq. They're saying that there has to be American involvement in who the new great leader of Iran is going to be. Trump just posted that in the past hour. But of course, the existing regime and the theocracy and the idea that it's run by a supreme leader is something that the Americans and the Israelis are fundamentally uncomfortable with. And there's no mechanism to get from here to there. You can destroy Iran's military capabilities. That's very clear. They've done that once before last year, and they're doing it again. But that's very different from destroying the capability of the Iranians to run and repress their own people. And again, 1 week into this war, they are nowhere close to that latter outcome.
And basically, you would suggest that there is no sign whatsoever of a rebellion or a protest or a revolution on the ground, none whatsoever?
Not yet, not at all. And by the way, there wouldn't be.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
With all of these strikes going on. So even if there was such a plan, you would at least wait until the smoke had cleared, as it were. But, look, this regime appears to have core support of like 20% of the Iranian population, some 93 million people in Iran total. That support, of course, is virtually zero in the ethnic areas that are non-Iranian. So, I mean, sort of where the Azeris are in Northwest, for example, and the Kurdish areas, the Baluch areas, that sort of thing. So let's say 30% or more of the Iranian population in and around Tehran supports the regime. Those that oppose it, many of them oppose it as strongly as one could imagine, given how repressive it's been. And yet they're not organized into opposition. They're certainly not armed and trained. And the United States is not prepared to put substantial boots on the ground to facilitate that process. So, I mean, even if we were to see this is one of the things that I'm concerned about is, let's say the war's over, and at that point, there are big demonstrations, and then the Iranian government comes and mows down its own people again. What's the United States going to do? This will, at that point, look like an enormous personal failing of the American president, which, of course, implies that the war might go on for a lot longer than people have been expecting.
It's also a war of attrition, right? It cannot go on at this pace. You'll run out of interceptor missiles and you'll run out of ballistic missiles on the other side. The pace at which both are being deployed, there's only so many weeks that this can go on. I use the word weeks. Some personally think it's a matter of days. Would you agree?
At the level that it has gone, that's already been true. The Iranians are no longer launching drones at the same numbers that they did at the beginning of the week. And the ballistic missiles, they're clearly well under 1,000 total remaining at this point, and many of the launch facilities have been destroyed. The interceptor availability is also coming down, but the fact that you have reduced capacity to hit each other doesn't equate to the end of the war. And if you have fewer interceptors, then all you need is the Iranians to get lucky with some drones, and suddenly this looks very problematic indeed. Now, Israel is not within drone range, so the Israelis don't need to worry about that directly. They've reopened the front with Hezbollah, but Hezbollah only initiated that with 6 missiles. Before the decapitation of Hezbollah, that was 40, 50, 100 missiles with one salvo. So already you would see that the Iranian proxy network in the region is much diminished from what it was. We've not heard anything from the Houthis. Many are saying, well, that's going to be a game changer when they come in. But the Houthis understand they're not going to make much money from Iran going forward. They've always been more independent. And my understanding from the Gulf is that Houthi representatives have reached out to Gulf states looking for a better deal. Yeah. Saying, hey, we'll extort you if you're willing to pay us off. We don't need to listen to the Iranians. We don't need to actually threaten the tankers going through, and we'll see whether or not that's successful. So already, as you suggest, the intensity of the war is significantly lower than it was a week ago. But that does not mean that the numbers of Iranians that get killed is going to go down substantially. There, it has much more to do with the nature and the persistence of the regime.
Ian, will the Strait of Hormuz closure last weeks or months, in your opinion?
There isn't a blockade. And so I think that much of this is a question of preemptorily hardening and providing better air defenses so that the Qataris, for example, don't feel like they are one drone strike away from a major disruption and damage. You've heard some statements that they're not going to restart operations and export until the war is over. I don't believe that, but I think that's a point of leverage to ensure that the Americans are providing more defense and support. So I probably am in the days to 1 to 2 weeks camp of disruption, not a month or two or more. Again, with the exception that one significant unlucky strike that hits could change the way we think about this. There are real tail risks here.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been an Iranian submarine, which I beg your pardon, an Iranian warship sunk by an American submarine.
It's now a submarine.
It is now a submarine. But then there are a lot of people in my country who are fairly offended by the fact that this Iranian warship was in Visakhapatnam. It was participating in the International Fleet Review. It was probably unarmed, and it was headed home. I know you can always argue that, this is war. But then there's the other argument that, why attack an essentially unarmed ship and a really small one far away from home, which is not really participating in the war as well? And where does that leave India?
Yeah, you saw that Sri Lanka offered safe port to another Iranian vessel that was participating.
And good on them for doing that. It's a fairly courageous thing for the Sri Lankans to have stood up to America, presumably, and said, no, that's not on. These sailors are coming into our country. We'll take the ship elsewhere.
Yeah, but I understand why they did it. And I'm not surprised that India didn't. Of course, Prime Minister Modi was just in Israel literally 2 days before the hostilities started. He obviously was comfortable. He knew that the war was imminent and likely. Didn't stop him from showing support to the Israeli Prime Minister at all. So India's obviously leaning on one side of these hostilities and providing some cover for the Americans and the Israelis in that regard. And that means also providing some ownership of some of these strikes that are very hard to justify. It is unusual, to say the least, that you would engage in blowing up a ship that may well be unarmed and certainly was welcomed as part of these multilateral ceremonies that the Americans were going to participate in themselves, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they did.
So I think they pulled out at the last minute, my understanding.
I'll have to check on that. But no, I take your point. But what I found strange about this particular episode was New Delhi's response, which came 24 hours later, where they actually said that they had tried to help. They had flown in planes when the distress call was made. They did have life rafts in place. There was a training ship which was pushed in. There was a second ship which was pushed in and was looking for possible survivors or mortal remains even yesterday. It took them 24 hours to come out with the statement. We asked them that, this has happened. I found that to be strange. Obviously, they weren't ready to talk about what they'd done, which was the normal thing to have
because
done.
they weren't comfortable Anything that they said could and might be used against them by the United States and Israel. They didn't want that. They didn't want to be seen by their own people as indifferent to the suffering of the Iranians that got blown up. And so, I mean, I think it is probably true that they provided that humanitarian support immediately. I have no reason to doubt that. But they certainly did not have comms ready to discuss any of this because it's politically fraught for the Indian Prime Minister.
What role might China or Russia play in de-escalation?
Well, the Russians have been providing some targeting support and intelligence to Iran for U.S. bases in the region. So they're not doing very much militarily, but they clearly are acting as a belligerent in support of Iran at this point. Let's keep in mind that Russia's drone force being used in Ukraine has been stood up with great support from the Islamic Republic. There's been, and of course, the Russians are benefiting mightily from the spike in oil prices, the spike in natural gas prices, and the fact that so much of this is costing the Europeans mightily. So the Russians are benefiting in many ways from this, even as they are set to lose yet another aligned country, as they did Bashar Assad in Syria, as they have Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and on and on and on. The Chinese are upset. They don't like to see this. They don't mind the Americans wasting a lot of military capabilities in the Middle East that they can't redeploy to Asia. They have sent a special envoy to the Middle East to show that they want peace, they want stability, which is true as far as it goes. But of course, China has been responsible for the purchase of 80% of exported Iranian crude, with no concerns about the nature of the regime whatsoever. The big point here is that this isn't changing the summit meeting that Xi Jinping is going to have with Trump at all.
No.
This is not undermining the tacit détente and stabilization of economic relations between the two countries. The Chinese have a great deal of capacity to hit the Americans back for perceived injustices economically. They do not have those capabilities militarily.
Would you agree that it's an interesting world where Volodymyr Zelensky offers to help America deal with Shahid drones and says that, could you please help us out with more Patriot missiles?
Well, the Americans are overstretched. They're selling huge numbers of weapons to the Europeans for Ukraine. They've had enormous amounts of buildup, some of which is still stationed right off of the Venezuelan coast. They're planning long-term for Cuban operations. And now they also are involved in an active and pretty extensive war in Iran. And yes, the U.S. is the most capable global military in the world. No one is close. But this is still stretching American capabilities and weapons stockpiles to their limit.
Okay. Is there a possibility of a broader involvement from NATO nations in this war? We've seen varying statements, some support, some lack of support. But as this stretches on longer, do you believe that the United Kingdom and other nations might be more involved? France?
The Brits are allowing their bases to be used for sorties. They have made some legal definitions around what that does and does not imply. But the reality is that means the Americans can run twice as many sorties with their B-2s and other long-range bombers as they could if they did not have access to those critical British bases. And the Prime Minister, Starmer, has taken a lot of inbound hostility in his own country for facilitating that. He's making virtually nobody happy in the UK, but he's got his own problems. He's not going to be there for very long. The French have been directly opposed and said this is a breach of international law. The Germans were supportive when Chancellor Merz was meeting with Trump in the White House 2 days ago, but have not provided any willingness to support operationally the Americans. The Spaniards have quite notably said they will not allow any of their bases to be used by the United States. Trump was quite angry about that. Yeah. Let's remember that the United States did not make any effort to coordinate with their allies in advance of these strikes. They did not give them any warning in advance that would have allowed them to prepare their populations for evacuations and the like, to create more readiness for their own bases in the region. There is an enormous amount of mistrust on the back of that, on the back of Greenland, on the back of America pulling their direct support for Ukraine. So I think the transatlantic relationship, frankly, is in crisis right now. And that will clearly limit the willingness of any NATO allies to provide direct support for the United States in a war that most of them consider to be illegal.
You mentioned Greenland. Is the heat off Greenland? I asked this partially because after Davos, where we met, I went to Greenland and I was in Nuuk for several days to sort of get a sense of what was happening. But it doesn't seem
the
to be in the
United
news
States
anymore.
recognized they had no mechanism to take Greenland. There's no mechanism for an effective referendum. The Europeans were prepared to hit the Americans with reciprocal tariffs after threatening them with tariffs. Trump did. And used for the first time the anti-coercion instrument at the EU level, which is within the competence of the European Union authorities to do without a vote. All of that forced President Trump to back down with nothing to show for it. This was an overreach on his part, and it was a loss on his part. There's still some talk about Greenland. It's not over. I'm sure that there'll be further headlines to be made. But the idea that the Americans were somehow going to take it is nowhere close to urgent at this point.
How sustainable is U.S. domestic support for the conflict?
It's already low. Support for Iran is a minority of Americans. It's a majority of Republicans, but a slim majority, and they don't trust that they know why it is that the U.S. is doing it. It's clearly a war of choice. It's not a war that is being fought because American national interests were being imminently threatened. And right now, gas prices in the U.S. are the highest they have been at any point in both Trump administrations. After Trump said during the State of the Union at the beginning how proud he was that gas prices were so low. Now he's saying he doesn't worry about it. Prices can go up. All of this does not sound like an America First policy. 6 American servicemen and women have been killed. Surely more are likely to be. This will be very unpopular among American servicemen and women, many of whom voted for Trump. Their communities, many of whom are red states, voted for Trump. So I think that this is a negative for him. And it's a negative in the context of a Trump that already is looking likely to lose midterm elections substantially, especially with the House likely to flip. It may well be, if this war goes on for 2 months or more and oil prices stay high and more Americans get killed, this could easily be the biggest mistake in foreign policy of Trump's entire administration.
Yeah. What is a realistic path to a ceasefire now, in your opinion?
The Americans deciding to be a ceasefire. I mean, that is really all it is. I mean, Trump has called for unconditional surrender in the last 2 hours. He did the same thing during the 12-day war. There was no unconditional surrender. This war will be over when Trump decides that he's going to announce that he has accomplished all of his goals better than any president in American history. He will surely do that at some point, but it does not appear to be imminent.
How might Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates respond long term? They are in trouble militarily at this stage. And no matter how much support they get from America, they can only take hits to a certain extent. I was seeing the satellite footage of hits on Saudi Arabian refineries, on Bahrain as well, other places. That's a real mess.
Yeah, I mean, the Saudis have done better on this front so far than the Emiratis had. The Emiratis, they really rely on safe haven status as a transit hub, as a tourist destination, as a safe and welcoming spot for expats of every stripe. And when you hit their hotels and you hit their airport, that's pretty existential for that message. So I think that does really undermine the Emiratis, and that's why you saw that well-known billionaire Emirati businessman that came out with a very strong message against Trump, saying, "Why are you doing this to us? You know, who gave you the authority to make us so vulnerable and start this war?" It certainly wasn't the Emiratis that wanted decapitation strikes against the supreme leader and his supporters, even as the Emiratis have active relations with Israel. And I did find it notable that he went after the U.S. and not after the Israelis at all. But that's business, as they say. Look, they're not happy.
Yeah.
They're not happy, but they also rely on the Americans militarily, and there's nobody else to rely on. Again, the world is more multipolar economically, but from a security perspective, the world is still unipolar. The United States is the only country that has the ability and the wherewithal to actually project military force globally. The Chinese are nowhere, the Russians are nowhere, and the country that is dominant in the region in the Middle East is Israel, which is America's closest ally, and where the United States coordinated very closely in the intelligence sharing and in the strikes that we've seen over the last week. And if you're in the Gulf, that makes you deeply uncomfortable.
Is it your sense that we are headed to a scenario where there is no regime change and then both sides just somehow or the other move away from the fighting? We are back into this bizarre status quo type situation where nobody is won and nobody is lost. Of course, Iran has been hit much harder on the ground, but their regime might still be intact.
That's the most likely scenario, but there's a low level of confidence given how early we are in this, and how comparatively emboldened some of the internal fighting forces could be inside Iran. So, I mean, the regime is going to be weaker, and they're going to be facing fights on multiple fronts, not least from their own population and from the Kurds. So, yeah, I think that's the baseline scenario, but I don't know that I'm very confident in it. More broadly than that, even if that's what happens, it's going to happen following the supreme leader being assassinated, following the IRGC leaders being assassinated. And to me, that implies that there will continue to be Iranian efforts to engage in espionage strikes, drone strikes, cyber attacks, maybe support terrorist attacks at a higher rate, even if their resources are constrained, in support of anti-Semitic attacks globally, which have already been at record highs, as well as strikes against American civilians. And that's something which means that even when the war is eventually over, the likelihood that hostilities restart at any moment is pretty high. So looking more like Israel-Lebanon, more like Israel-Gaza, than looking like the status quo ante of the United States and Iran.
A final question. What do you make of the three F-15s being shot down, apparently by a Kuwaiti F-18? A simple case of mistaken identity, because technically it's not supposed to happen that way at all. Is this the last we've heard of it?
Well, it shows that the Kuwaitis have more effective air defenses than the Iranians do. I mean, the Iranians haven't knocked a single American fighter jet out of the sky. The Kuwaitis got 3. So at least we find that the capabilities are on the side of the United States and the allies. These things happen. If you ask me about mistakes that I'm worried about, I'm most worried about 150 estimated school children that were killed by what looks to have been an errant American missile. That's the mistake that's going to hurt the most. None of those American airmen were killed. They all were managed to eject, and they got to safety. I wish we could say the same for those Iranian school kids.
No, I completely agree. Look, Ian, it's been wonderful as always talking to you. We've discussed so many wars over the last couple of years. Where is the peace? Who knows? But thanks very much once again for being with us.
Always good to see you. Thanks a lot, my friend.